Hello everyone. In this video we'll see concept of cluster analysis. Okay, right. So what is meant by cluster analysis? So cluster analysis is nothing but uh, this grouping of objects which are similar in nature. For example, grouping of products which are similar in nature. If you can think, there will be we can group people based on their similar age or similar characteristics or say similar income. Okay, so cluster is nothing but if you can see in the graph in the bottom left, pink color, they are all similar in pink color, so they form one cluster. And you can see the blue color, we cannot say is blue color, it's like cyan color, which are together, which are again in x-axis. They form one cluster. And if you could able to see here on the right side, there are stars, circle shaped and rectangle shaped objects. And if you form a cluster, whoever are similar, they will be segmented, or say they will form close clustering. So that is nothing but a group of objects or people which are having a same similarity. That is what is cluster is all about. Now coming to, suppose say if you have given, if you give this images to some of the students without any label, or say if you give this to kids and without informing what is what, which variable is what, so how do they deal with this data? What they will do is they'll arrange this in the group based on the similarity. Like they may arrange based on four-legged animal. Okay, for example, lion, elephants and rhino and camel, giraffe. Why they all are in animals group? They can be grouped together, or else we can also group them separately. Again further we can separate them, long neck animals separately. Okay, herbivorous, carnivorous, like that also we can keep on clustering. Okay, so if you give this puzzle to a baby, what he'll do is, he or she will do is, just they'll arrange a cluster, or say based on similarity. And what they have done here is they have just arranged animals separately and fish, sea living animals separately. Okay, these are one group, these are one group. If you go for subcluster, you can take some more criteria, and then you can, based on that criteria, you can cluster. Now what is cluster analysis? Cluster analysis comes under multivariate techniques whose primary purpose is to group objects based on characteristics, or say similar characteristics they possess. And if we just talk about in machine learning terms, it comes under unsupervised learning method. That means there are no labels, pre-qualified labels are not given here, like how we give in supervised learning, like which is independent variable, which is dependent variable. There is no concept of dependent or independent variable in this cluster analysis. It's just, that is why it is called as unsupervised learning method in context of machine learning. It forms cluster of similar objects automatically, segments the data so that each training example is assigned to a segment. Clustering is actually the process of dividing the data sets into groups consisting of similar data points. That's what we discussed earlier. Points in same group are similar as possible, and points in different groups are dissimilar as possible. The major objective of cluster analysis is data reduction. How do you reduct data? Classifying large group of respondents into some meaningful groups. Okay, if you just take example of marketing, if you have a transaction data, you can group customer data based on their level of spendings. Who are the customers who are purchasing more than 10,000, or say more than some specific amount? Who are the customers who are in the same group? Like based on some one or two criteria, they will be similar, either through income, either through age, or either through frequency pattern or shopping pattern. It depends. So like that, the major objective of cluster analysis is to classify large group of respondents into meaningful groups. Then we analyze them based on the methods. Coming to application of cluster analysis helps in identification of areas of similar land use in meteorological studies, or say geographic studies. Okay, It helps in identification of groups of houses in a city according to the house type, or say house value, land value, and geographic location. And in the field of biology, it can be used to derive plant and animal taxonomies, categorize genes, species in similar functionalities, and gain insights into structures inherent to populations. So it is also used in the field of biology. And in marketing, from business perspective, it is majorly applied in marketing, finding groups of customers with similar behavior. Customer segmentation is nothing but grouping of observation of respondents who are similar in some pattern based on some criteria. For example, to identify group of diners in the restaurant, grouping the content of website or product in retail business. Most of this application used by Netflix, Amazon, and Flickr to customize, say to segment customers based on the usage behavior, or say based on the content, genres. Okay, so these are applied. These are used by organizations like Netflix, Amazon, and Flickr. So when we talk about clustering, we have two types. One is called hierarchical clustering, and the other one is non-hierarchical clustering. So in hierarchical clustering, there are two types: agglomerative and divisive technique. And in non-hierarchical, we have k-means and fuzzy c-means technique. When going for a hierarchical clustering, we need two major criteria. One is the distance measure, okay, and the other one is linkage criterion. And we'll see that in detail in the upcoming slide. As hierarchical clustering, as I said, there are two types. So we are currently looking into hierarchical clustering. So under hierarchical clustering, there are two types: agglomerative and divisive. So what happens in agglomerative? Agglomerative actually starts from a single object to, based on the similarity, it will keep on going on forming the cluster. For example, step 1, consider each observation as a single cluster. Okay, like each different in this x1 x2 coordinate, say these are the like for example, these each are individual clusters, okay, initially. Then what happens is like based on the distance or similarity, they form a cluster. And since these two are close, they form a cluster, and these two are nearby, so they form a cluster. And later on, what happens is, from this 1, 2, and 3, whichever similar, or by the distance measure, if they are close, they get form one cluster. And since these 2 points are under second cluster, and this point is closer to this one, like second cluster compared to the first cluster, so it gets joined with second cluster and first cluster. Then finally it forms a whole together, one single cluster. So that's the process based on agglomerative hierarchical clustering. So here I have mentioned the steps. Step 2, group the most similar objects using some similarity measures, and merge the similar groups into new cluster, and finally you will end up with one single cluster. Coming to the divisive hierarchical clustering, it is just opposite of what agglomerative does. So agglomerative starts from single and ends up with the whole group. Here it is the opposite way. It starts with like for example, it starts with a single cluster. Then based on inside the cluster, based on the similar dissimilarity points, it will keep on dividing the clusters, and finally it will end up with individual cluster. And this representation is called a dendrogram. And in dendrogram, the agglomerative, as we say, from individual cells to a large single cell. And in divisive, it goes from whole large cell to towards a single observation, or say single cluster. And if we go a little bit in detail to understand the hierarchical clustering, let us see this. Let's consider we have few points in xy coordinates as p1, p2, p5, p6, p3, p4. Okay, and each point, let us consider that each points are in one cluster. They are individual cluster. Then p1, p2 is nearby, so they'll form one cluster. p3 and p4 are nearby, they'll form one cluster. And p5, p6 are nearby, so they'll form one cluster. And finally, p5, p6 and p3, p4 are closer, like red and blue color, they are closer, so that will be one cluster. And then finally all together will come under one single cluster. So this process is called agglomerative clustering. So like for example, there is a criteria to measure the distance. So the distance measure is nothing but the measure will determine the similarity between elements and it will influence the shape of the cluster. So to measure the distance in hierarchical clustering, we use these four methods: Euclidean distance, squared Euclidean distance method, Manhattan distance measure, and cosine distance measure. So in this, majorly applied application is Euclidean distance measure. And Euclidean distance measure is nothing but it is an ordinary straight line. It says the distance between 2 points in Euclidean space, and it is measured using d is equal to square root of summation of n to I q minus p the whole square. So that p to q is the value of Euclidean distance. So based on this formula, Euclidean distance of each data points is calculated. And the second method, you have squared Euclidean distance measure. It uses the same equation as Euclidean distance but does not take the square root. So same formula like previous one, but just you remove the square root and you will get the you will calculate the data points distance based on this method. And Manhattan distance measure is slightly different. It is the simple sum of horizontal and vertical components, or say the distance between 2 points is measured along the axis at right angles. So it works on the principles of right angles. So here's the formula for it. So it's a little different method which works on the basis of right angles. And the last method we have is cosine distance measure. It is a measure the angle between the two vectors, and based on the cosine distance this works, and this is the formula for it. When we talk about hierarchical clustering, there are two things. One is distance measure, the other one is linkage criterion. So under linkage criterion we have five methods: single linkage, complete linkage, average linkage, centroid linkage, and Watts method. Let us see each one of them. Single linkage is nothing but it works on the principle like there are two clusters, there are two data points of clusters. So whichever is cluster is like nearby with the end part of it. Like for example, for this cluster, this is in the this end, and for the cluster 1 this is the end side, and for the cluster 2 this is the end side. So whichever is nearer, that straight point gets connected here under single linkage method. Complete linkage method actually is just an opposite of single linkage method. It takes, for example, these are the two clusters, it takes the end point of each cluster, like distanced point of each cluster. Okay, that is what is shown here. And average linkage method is nothing but it takes the average of these data points as a linkage method. So that's about this average linkage method. As you can see, there are a little bit more details given in single linkage method. As I told you, in single linkage method the shortest distance, like from one cluster to other cluster, or say nearest neighbor concept, is used in single linkage method, and it is suitable when there are patterns of cluster in circular type as shown in the figure. And in complete linkage method, you can say like farthest neighbor. Okay, the previous one, single linkage method, worked based on nearest neighbor. Here if there are two clusters, it will take the longest distance points. Okay, so it is useful when your data is densely when your clustering data looks very having a high density like this as shown in the picture. Green dotted lines are heavily densed in one particular area, and blue color points are heavily dense in one particular area. For those kind of situation, complete linkage method is used. And as I already told you, average linkage method is nothing but it takes the mean between the clusters and it tries to connect. So whichever is the shortest mean, it will connect to that cluster. And Watts method, which is one of the famous method used in most of the hierarchical clustering, it is also known as minimum variance method, is just alternative to single link clustering. Watts method starts out with n clusters of size 1 and continues until all observations are included into one cluster. So that is the concept how this Watts method works. And coming to the centroid method, it calculates the distance between means of two clusters, and finally it whichever is having a minimum distance in means, so it gets collaborated or same gets mixed with the nearest cluster. So that is the concept of centroid method.